My sister-in-law tried to poison me when I announced my pregnancy. She's now in prison. The day my sister-in-law tried to kill me, she smiled. Not when her husband collapsed after eating the poisoned shrimp meant for me, but earlier, when she handed me the plate, knowing exactly what shellfish would do to my pregnant body. I used to think fairy tales could come true. For 7 years, Harry and I built what anyone would call a perfect life. Our son Ethan had Harry's warm eyes and my stubborn chin, and our careers gave us the stability we'd both craved since childhood. From the outside, we were that couple everyone envied, the ones who still held hands after all these years, who never went to bed angry, who had somehow cracked the code to lasting happiness. But there's one detail I always leave out when describing my perfect life. Jessica. When I first met Harry's older sister, I was genuinely charmed. Jessica had this magnetic confidence that commanded every room. She was successful, stylish, and fiercely protective of her little brother. I remember thinking how lucky I was to be marrying into a family with such strong bonds. It took me nearly a year to notice the cracks in her polished facade. You know, they made such a beautiful couple back then, Jessica said during a family dinner, casually mentioning Harry's ex while looking directly at me. The table fell silent. Harry quickly changed the subject, but the damage was done. That was just the beginning. Soon I noticed a pattern. Somehow, Harry's exes would, coincidentally, appear at family gatherings, always because Jessica had bumped into them and extended an invitation. She was the first to view our social media posts but never liked or commented. She'd offer unsolicited opinions about our house, my cooking, even how we were raising Ethan. One evening, Harry came home unusually quiet. When I finally coaxed it out of him, he told me he'd overheard Jessica talking to their mother. "Mom, are you sure he wants to stay with her?" "I think he could do so much better," she'd said. His mother just shook her head silently. That night, I lay awake beside my sleeping husband, a chill creeping up my spine. Was Jessica just an overprotective sister who couldn't let go? Or was there something more sinister beneath her carefully constructed smiles? The question haunted me, but I kept pushing it away. After all, who would believe that my picture-perfect life had such an ugly shadow? I tried to ignore the warning signs for months. I told myself I was being paranoid, that Jessica was just overprotective of her brother. But as our wedding approached, her behavior became impossible to dismiss. Despite her obvious disdain for me, Jessica inserted herself into every wedding preparation meeting. She had opinions on everything: the venue, the music, the guest list. Nothing was good enough. During a meeting with our florist, I mentioned wanting white roses for my bouquet. Before I could finish my sentence, Jessica cut in. "White roses look so cheap, don't you think? You should consider something more elegant, like what Lily had at her engagement party." Harry tensed beside me. Lily was his college girlfriend, the one Jessica still described as the one that got away. Susan, my future mother-in-law, shot Jessica a warning glance, but it didn't stop her. The pattern continued for weeks. Every decision I made was wrong. Every idea I had was inferior. She'd casually reference Harry's exes or suggest I was somehow not good enough for her brother. It was death by 1,000 cuts, each comment carefully crafted to seem innocent to others while cutting me to the bone. It all came to a head during our menu tasting. Jessica had spent the entire afternoon making snide comments about my taste, my family, even my career. Something inside me finally snapped. "Jessica," I said, my voice surprisingly steady, "if you hate our wedding so much, maybe you shouldn't come." The room went completely silent. Harry froze mid-sentence. Susan's fork clattered against her plate. Jessica stared at me as though I'd slapped her, her eyes wide with disbelief. No one had ever challenged her before. After what felt like an eternity, she stood up, grabbed her designer purse, and walked out without a word. The door slammed behind her with such force that the wine glasses rattled. "I'm sorry," I whispered to the stunned table. "I shouldn't have—" "No," Susan interrupted, reaching for my hand. Someone needed to say it. Jessica disappeared for days after that. No calls, no texts, complete radio silence. Harry was worried sick, but I felt like I could breathe for the first time in months. Then, a week later, Harry's phone pinged with a message from his sister. "Your wife humiliated me in front of everyone. You need to control her. Harry showed me the message but didn't respond. 3 days later, I received a text from Jessica that made my skin crawl. I'm sorry for being difficult. I'm really looking forward to your wedding. Hope you can forgive me. The saccharine sweetness of it, the complete lack of genuine remorse. It was more disturbing than her anger. I never replied. Our wedding day arrived, and everything was perfect. The ceremony went off without a hitch. At the reception, Harry and I were making our rounds, thanking guests and accepting congratulations when a hush fell over the crowd. Jessica had arrived. She was wearing a floor-length black gown with a black veil, like she was attending a funeral rather than a wedding. She moved through the reception like a dark specter, whispering to guests with a pained expression. I caught fragments of what she was saying. Losing my only brother and such a difficult day for our family. I stood frozen, my champagne glass halfway to my lips. Harry's face had drained of all color. Our perfect day was being deliberately sabotaged by the one person who should have been celebrating with us. Susan and Robert exchanged a look I couldn't interpret. Then, with quiet determination, they approached their daughter. Robert whispered something in Jessica's ear while Susan took her arm firmly. Within minutes, they were escorting her out of the venue, Jessica's protests barely audible over the music. When Susan returned, her eyes were red, but her voice was steady. I'm sorry, she said, hugging me tightly. We should have done that a long time ago. As Harry and I swayed on the dance floor later that night, I couldn't shake the chill that had settled over me. Jessica had been publicly rebuked for the first time in her life. But something told me this wasn't the end. It was just the beginning of a war I never asked to fight. After the wedding disaster, Jessica vanished from our lives as suddenly as a snuffed candle. No calls, no texts, no passive-aggressive comments on our social media. She was gone, and the silence was blissful. Harry occasionally mentioned her, a flicker of worry crossing his face, but even he seemed relieved by her absence. When our son Ethan was born, we sent a birth announcement to every family member, including Jessica. No response came. Susan told us Jessica had moved to Chicago with a new boyfriend, but offered no further details. We didn't press for more. For a full year, we lived in peaceful ignorance of Jessica's existence. That peace shattered on a rainy Sunday afternoon when our doorbell rang unexpectedly. I opened the door to find Jessica standing on our porch, soaked from the rain, her normally perfect appearance disheveled. Her eyes were puffy and rimmed with red, her skin pale and drawn. She looked broken in a way I'd never seen before. I'm sorry, she whispered, her voice cracking. I was wrong. Harry appeared behind me, our son balanced on his hip. Jessica's eyes darted to Ethan, widening slightly. Can I come in? She asked, and against my better judgment, I stepped aside. Over tea, Jessica told us her story. She'd been pregnant 2 years ago before our wedding. She'd lost the baby in her second trimester, a little girl they'd already named Emma. The grief had twisted something inside her, she explained, made her jealous and bitter when she saw Harry's happiness with me. I was horrible to you, she said, looking directly at me for the first time. The things I did at your wedding. I'm ashamed. I understand if you can't forgive me, but I'd like to know my nephew. I'd like to be part of your family again. Harry squeezed my hand under the table. I knew what he wanted. His family whole again. The sister he'd grown up with back in his life. But something in Jessica's story didn't quite ring true. The timing felt convenient, the tears a little too practiced. Still, I nodded. We can try, I said, and the relief on Harry's face almost convinced me I'd made the right decision. Jessica became a regular fixture in our home after that. She brought Ethan toys, read him stories, played with him for hours. On the surface, she was the perfect aunt, attentive, loving, generous, but I caught moments that made my skin crawl. Once, while I was preparing lunch in the kitchen, I saw Jessica through the doorway, holding Ethan close and whispering in his ear. When she noticed me watching, she smoothly transitioned into a nursery rhyme, smiling innocently. That night, I asked Ethan what Aunt Jessica had whispered to him. She said Mommy isn't nice to her, he replied, his innocent eyes confused. Is that true? Another time I overheard her telling Ethan, when you grow up, you have to love Aunt Jessica, not like your mommy does, okay? I confronted her later that evening, when Harry wasn't home. I heard what you said to Ethan, I said, my voice steady despite my racing heart. Jessica's face transformed instantly, the mask of contrition dropping away. He's my nephew. I'm allowed to talk to him. Not if you're poisoning him against me. She laughed, a cold sound that raised goosebumps on my arms. You're paranoid, Emily. Maybe you should see someone about that. While Jessica was playing her role as the doting aunt, her own marriage was crumbling. She'd married Daniel shortly after our wedding, a whirlwind romance that had surprised everyone. Less than a year later, they were fighting constantly. The issue, according to Jessica, was their inability to conceive. It's Daniel's fault, she told anyone who would listen. He can't perform properly. The doctors say he's the problem. Daniel never defended himself, just sat silently while Jessica humiliated him in front of family and friends. I tried to reach out to him once, but he just shook his head sadly and walked away. When Jessica showed up at our door with suitcases claiming she needed space from Daniel, Harry didn't hesitate to offer our guest room. I wanted to object, but one look at his hopeful face silenced me. He truly believed his sister had changed. Living with Jessica quickly became unbearable. She was everywhere, inserting herself between Harry and me at every opportunity. She made breakfast for him before I woke up. She did his laundry, folding his clothes the way their mother had when they were children. She monopolized every conversation, turning discussions of our day into reminiscences about their shared childhood, memories I couldn't participate in. Then she started watching me, tracking my movements with suspicious eyes. I woke up early each morning to go to the gym before work, a routine I'd maintained for years. One morning, as I was packing my gym bag, Jessica appeared in the kitchen doorway. "Why do you have to go to the gym every morning?" she asked, her voice casual but her eyes sharp. I laughed awkwardly. "You know, staying in shape. Plus I shower there so I don't go to work all sweaty." Jessica tilted her head, studying me like a scientist might examine a curious specimen. "Or maybe there's someone at the gym you're meeting." The accusation hung in the air between us. I felt as though I'd been doused in ice water. "Excuse me?" I managed to say. "Nothing," she replied with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Just wondering why a married woman needs to look so good for strangers." That night, I told Harry we needed to talk. Something had to change. Harry listened as I explained Jessica's insinuations about the gym, his face darkening with each word. He ran his hands through his hair, a gesture I knew meant he was deeply troubled. "I'll talk to her," he promised, but I could see the conflict in his eyes. He wanted to believe his sister had changed, that the family he remembered from childhood could be whole again. The conversation never happened. Each time Harry tried to broach the subject, Jessica deflected masterfully, either bursting into tears about her failing marriage or changing the subject to childhood memories that excluded me entirely. 2 weeks passed with Jessica's presence poisoning our home. The tension was becoming unbearable. Then came the family dinner that changed everything. Susan and Robert had joined us, eager to spend time with their grandson. The evening started pleasantly enough. Jessica was on her best behavior when her parents were around. We were discussing a mutual friend's recent divorce when Jessica casually dropped her bomb. "Harry, did you and Emily sign a prenup?" she asked, cutting through the conversation like a knife. The table fell silent. Harry set down his fork slowly. "No," he replied carefully. "We trust each other." Jessica's laugh was brittle as she shrugged. "Well, infidelity is so common these days. Seems risky not to have one." I felt my cheeks burning as everyone at the table shifted uncomfortably. Susan cleared her throat, clearly preparing to change the subject, but Jessica wasn't finished. "You know," she continued, her eyes fixed on Ethan, who was happily playing with his food, oblivious to the tension. "Ethan doesn't really look much like you, Harry." The room temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. Harry's parents froze mid-movement, their expressions a mixture of shock and horror. Harry's face drained of all color. "What did you just say?" he asked, his voice dangerously quiet. Jessica maintained her innocent expression, but her eyes gleamed with malice. "Just an observation. Haven't you ever wondered if he's really yours?" The words hung in the air like poison gas. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't move. She had finally said out loud what she'd been implying for weeks, that I was unfaithful, that our son wasn't Harry's. The accusation was so outrageous, So cruel. I couldn't even form words to defend myself. I didn't have to. Harry stood up so abruptly his chair crashed to the floor behind him. Ethan startled at the noise and began to whimper. What kind of person are you? Harry's voice was barely controlled fury. Do you even hear yourself? Do you understand what you're saying? Jessica's smug expression faltered slightly. You don't deserve to be a mother, Harry continued, each word precise and devastating. That baby you lost? She's better off in heaven than having you as a mother. The color drained from Jessica's face. In all our years together, I'd never heard Harry speak so cruelly to anyone. The dinner table fell into shocked silence, broken only by Ethan's confused crying. I instinctively moved to comfort him, lifting him from his high chair and holding him close. Get out of our house, Harry said, his voice now eerily calm. Now. Jessica looked around the table, clearly expecting someone, anyone, to defend her. But Susan and Robert sat in stony silence, their expressions unreadable. When nobody spoke up, Jessica slowly stood, gathered her purse, and walked to the door. You'll regret this, she said softly before leaving. All of you. After the door closed behind her, Robert buried his face in his hands. Susan reached across the table and squeezed my free hand. We should have done something about this years ago, she said, her voice thick with emotion. We kept hoping she would change, that she would grow out of this obsession. We failed you both. I'm so sorry. The next day, Robert and Susan came to help Jessica collect her things. She didn't speak to any of us, just silently packed her belongings while her parents supervised. Before they left, Robert pulled Harry aside. We're cutting her off, he said gravely. Financially, emotionally, completely. This has gone too far. I should have felt relief after Jessica left, but something in her parting words haunted me. You'll regret this. It wasn't said in anger or as an empty threat. She had spoken with absolute certainty, like she was simply stating a fact. That night, as Harry and I lay in bed, he broke the silence that had fallen between us. I'm sorry, he whispered, his voice raw. I should have seen who she really was a long time ago. I turned to face him in the darkness. Do you think it's over? He didn't answer immediately, and that hesitation told me everything I needed to know. Jessica had been completely isolated, cut off from her entire family. She had nothing left to lose. And people with nothing left to lose are the most dangerous of all. Life slowly returned to normal after Jessica's departure. For the first time in months, our home felt like a sanctuary again. Harry and I began rebuilding what Jessica had tried so hard to destroy. We talked more openly, spent quality time with Ethan, and reconnected with friends we'd neglected during Jessica's stay. 2 months after the confrontation, I discovered I was pregnant again. It wasn't planned. We'd been considering a second child, but thought we'd wait until Ethan was older. Still, the news filled us with joy, a bright spot after so much darkness. Let's announce it at your birthday party, I suggested to Harry. It would be perfect timing. Susan and Robert hosted Harry's birthday in their backyard, a casual gathering with close friends and family. The afternoon was picture perfect. Blue skies, gentle breeze, children playing on the lawn. I was helping Susan arrange desserts when a collective hush fell over the party. I turned to see Jessica standing at the garden entrance. My stomach dropped. Harry froze mid-conversation across the yard, his expression a mixture of shock and wariness. No one had invited her. No one had even told her about the party. Before anyone could react, Jessica crossed the lawn and threw her arms around Harry. I've missed you so much, she said, loud enough for everyone to hear. I'm sorry. I was wrong about everything. Harry stood rigid in her embrace, his eyes finding mine over her shoulder. I gave a slight nod, a silent agreement not to make a scene. It was his birthday, after all. Jessica turned to me next, her eyes red-rimmed as if she'd been crying. I've been in therapy, she said softly. I understand my mistakes now. I want to make amends. I didn't believe her for a second, but with everyone watching, I managed a tight smile and nodded. Robert and Susan exchanged worried glances but said nothing. The party continued, an undercurrent of tension beneath the forced normalcy. When it came time for toasts, Harry took my hand and stood. Emily and I have some news, he announced, his smile genuine despite the circumstances. "We're expecting another baby." Cheers erupted around us. Susan gasped with delight, rushing over to hug us both. Friends raised their glasses in celebration. Only Jessica remained still, her expression freezing momentarily before she recovered, plastering on a smile that didn't reach her eyes. I caught a flash of something in her gaze. Anger, resentment. But it vanished so quickly I wondered if I'd imagined it. The next moment she was clapping along with everyone else, offering congratulations that sounded hollow to my ears. As I sat down, Jessica approached with a plate of food. "I want to make it up to you," she said, her voice saccharine sweet. "I picked this out specially. You know, pregnant women need proper nutrition." I hesitated, staring at the plate. Every instinct screamed not to accept anything from her, but refusing would create an awkward scene. Reluctantly, I took the plate with a forced smile. "Thanks." Looking down, my heart stuttered. Shrimp. The plate was filled with shrimp cocktail. I'm severely allergic to shellfish. Harry knows this. His parents know this. And Jessica definitely knows this. Before I could decide what to do, Daniel, Jessica's husband, approached. I was surprised to see him. I thought they were separated. "Not eating?" he asked casually, eyeing the plate. "Mind if I have some?" "I'm starving." Before I could stop him, Daniel took the plate and began eating. Jessica watched from a few feet away, her expression unreadable. 5 minutes later, Daniel collapsed. One moment he was chatting with Harry's cousin, the next he was on his knees, clutching his throat. His face turned an alarming shade of white as he began to vomit violently. "Someone call an ambulance," Robert shouted, rushing to Daniel's side. The party descended into chaos. Children were ushered away while several people tried to help Daniel, who had begun convulsing on the grass. Jessica pushed through the crowd, screaming, "What's happening? What did you do to him?" she shrieked, her eyes wild as she knelt beside her husband. I stood frozen, unable to process what I was seeing. That plate had been meant for me. If Daniel hadn't taken it. The ambulance arrived within minutes. As paramedics loaded Daniel's unconscious body into the vehicle, one of them confirmed what I already suspected. "It looks like poisoning." Police arrived shortly after. They began interviewing guests, collecting statements about what everyone had seen. When the detective reached me, I felt the blood drain from my face. If I told the truth, that Jessica had handed me that plate, knowing I was allergic to shrimp, it would mean admitting she had tried to kill me. But if I said nothing, she might get away with it. I was still deciding what to tell the detective when Harry rushed to my side, his face ashen. "The security cameras," he said, his voice barely audible. "Dad installed them last month after that break-in next door." While I spoke with the police, Harry and his father reviewed the footage. Within an hour, they had irrefutable evidence. Jessica deliberately handing me the plate, watching with an unsettling smile as I accepted it, and then her poorly disguised shock when Daniel took it instead. When the detective saw the video, Jessica was immediately taken into custody. She sobbed dramatically as they led her away, insisting there had been a misunderstanding. "I just wanted her to get sick a little bit," she wailed during questioning. "I didn't try to kill anyone." But the toxicology report told a different story. The shrimp hadn't just been shrimp, it had been laced with enough poison to cause serious harm, especially to a pregnant woman. It was pure luck that Daniel hadn't eaten more than a few bites. As the investigation deepened, the true motive emerged. Jessica was also pregnant. She had planned to announce it at Harry's birthday party, but my announcement had stolen her thunder. The jealousy that had festered for years had finally driven her to an unthinkable act. Daniel filed for divorce from his hospital bed. The prosecutor charged Jessica with attempted poisoning, endangering an unborn child, and several other counts. At her sentencing, she begged her parents for help, for leniency, for understanding. Susan and Robert sat stone-faced in the courtroom. When they finally spoke, their words were quiet but final. "You've gone too far. We can't help you anymore." The judge sentenced Jessica to 12 years in prison. As they led her away, she looked back at me one last time, not with remorse but with an expression of pure hatred that still haunts my dreams. 8 months later, I gave birth to a healthy baby girl. We named her Hope, because that's what she represented for us. hope for a future untainted by Jessica's poison. The years that followed were peaceful on the surface. Ethan grew into a bright, curious boy who adored his little sister. Harry and I rebuilt our life together, surrounded by friends and family who supported us through everything. But some wounds never fully heal. I developed habits I couldn't shake, checking and rechecking food before eating it, preparing all meals myself, refusing to eat at restaurants. The therapist called it hypervigilance, a common response to trauma. I called it survival. Sometimes, catching my reflection in the mirror, I would pause and ask myself the question that never seemed to have a satisfying answer. How could Jessica have done this to me? The truth was simple, if impossible to fully comprehend. To Jessica, I was never a sister-in-law. I was never family. From the moment Harry chose me, I became her enemy. And enemies in Jessica's twisted mind had to be eliminated. Harry tells me that one day we'll be completely free of her shadow. I'm not sure I believe him yet, but as I watch our children play in the yard, untouched by the darkness that nearly destroyed us, I think maybe, just maybe, he might be right.